Hello everyone and welcome back to the coziest corner of YouTube, the RPG Radio. I'll be your winter host running from those Christmas ghosts, Windback. Today's grimdawn build is part 4 of the Deathly Dervish build, and this video will be all about components, augments, and some farm-worthy late-game legendary gear. At this point, we're in Ultimate, so you'll be taking the maximum damage possible, and we need to survive by capping out resistances by any means necessary. I'll also go ahead and apologize for my voice and the lack of video last week since the holiday hiatus met with a little combo of getting super sick. So that is about where we are at right now. If you haven't watched the first 3 videos in this series, then I recommend checking those out first. They'll get you acclimated to the build all the way down from level 1 to now. Each video in this series talks about specific power spikes and tries to focus in on small things that might get overlooked in some of my single episode build videos. This video is going to recap a couple things at the end of part 3 in case you didn't make it that far in the video, and we're going to pivot on a couple of the augments that I mentioned in the last video as well, since resistances have changed based on the gear that we are forcing into this build. Now, once we make it into Ultimate, we're going to need to refarm all of our monster infrequents, which isn't terribly difficult. Each of these has been explained previously in the series though, so we're not going to pull out the magnifying glass on any that previously got mentioned. Instead, we're going to start with the components and which ones will make the best use of the slot they have been equipped to. You can have a shiny new sword, but wouldn't it be cooler if you had a shiny new sword that had its own smaller shiny new sword to go with it? Speaking of swords, our very first component is going to be equipped to our main hand big bad boy. I mentioned this in the end of the last video briefly, but we're going to get some more visual aids for those who can't be bothered to click on the Grim Tools link. This component is called the Seal of the Night, and you can't even equip it until you've hit level 75. Seal of the Night is going to provide you buffs to your cold and frostburn damage, a flat increase to your cold damage, and a 10% conversion from your physical to cold damage as well. More importantly than all of that though, this component is going to give you offensive ability. Now that we've made it into Ultimate, OA is going to be very important, and it is a stat that you will need a lot of attention for because it is everything that you have to do in order to crit and actually hit monsters to deal damage in this difficulty. Since monsters have higher defensive ability in Ultimate, they're going to be statistically more difficult to hit in general, let alone crit. You're going to have to start nursing this stat like an incredibly gross beer that you ordered to try and seem cool to your blind date, and we all know how effective that tactic is. There is one more really fun aspect to talk about for the Seal of Night though, and everyone that has eyeballs may have already noticed that we use here and there as a ranged spammy ability. This component gives you access to the ability Chill Spikes. And Chill Spikes is basically a fan of ice daggers that you can throw rapidly to deal tons of cold, frostburn, and piercing damage from range or at point blank. It's interesting because the damage listed on the tooltip for the component is for a single projectile in the fan that you throw, but you throw 5 of them with every use. That means that the closer you are, the more daggers you hit, hence more damage. This obviously won't replace any of your current combo, but it is a very good tool when you need to kite a stubborn enemy, or if your rotation is all out of usable buttons. Since we're talking about seals, we also have to mention the one hanging around our neck on this amulet. The Seal of Ancestry can only be equipped to medals or amulets, and our medal is going to be the defensive option in this build. That said, the Seal of Ancestry is an all-gas, no-brakes, ball-slapping trip to the Thunderdome. Ancestry has 2 components just like the Seal of Night, but instead of an active ability, it's going to activate on a 15% chance on crit instead. You see what I mean about the OA? After landing the ability though, you're going to get a 20% reduction in the enemy's health. You're going to cut their health regen and shave a big chunk off both their offensive ability and defensive ability. Right off the top, that is about 5 seconds worth of shred on both of those stats. It's basically a mountain of damage layered together with the ability to deal even more damage. Add in the passive stat of the flat spirit increase of 20, 5% to both attack and casting speed, and you've got an Ed Boy raging all the way through the cul-de-sac with a rock in his shoe. Now, the cherry on top of this component is even better than all of that. After everything we just mentioned, you get a 10% reduction to all of your energy cost, and that means that we've just been given the key to ability spam heaven, and those angels are singing in the key of a smashed keyboard. Those two components are the only seals you'll be after though, since we've only got one weapon and some black tallow on our metal. This build, at least for the rolls I've gotten, is very light on the chaos resistance, and that means that being killed by all manner of chthonic enemy is going to be much easier than it was in normal and elite. The only way to offset this is with gear, augments, and components, of which there are very few that are actually equipable in the vein of chaos resistance. Black Tallow has 4 stats, but only 3 of them are going to be any good for us, and the first is the 6% less damage from chthonics. That means that any enemy that is the class of Chthonian will deal 6% less damage to us on the whole. After that, we've got 30 defensive ability, which is an all-around amazing stat for not getting hit as much, and we end it with a whopping 16% chaos resistance, because finding a drop of water in the desert is still the maximum hydration. The next component we want for increasing our chaos res is called Sanctified Bone, and no, this is not what the cleric and the wizard do in their spare time behind the outhouse when no one is watching. Sanctified Bone can only be equipped to head and chest armor, and in this case we're going to give it a nice new home right there on our pecs. This component is going to give you a straight up 8% increase to all of your damage to the undead and chthonic type enemies. More than that though, you'll be getting 12% chaos res to turn that little drop of water we were talking about into a little bit more of a teacup sized amount of water. You're also getting a big chunk of vitality resistance at 18% with this component, so if the gear that you've found so far hasn't been kind in that department, this bone should help with that immensely. After we're finished repurposing what's left of some poor dead guy's skull, we're going to hunt down some living armor. This one is going to be pushing the chaos res a bit higher, but compared to the last couple, it is definitely on the lower end of that percentage. The real reason that we're taking this is because this is one of the only chaos res components that you can put into your shoulder armor. To be fair, chaos resistance is tough to come by outside amulets, medals, and augments, but the good news is that the living armor also comes with an extra 10% elemental resistance bonus. It's also going to increase our armor absorption and gets extra sloppy with some offensive ability. If we're going to compromise for anything when it comes to our defensive stats, it is the offensive ability. For everyone who hasn't gone and looked at the Grim Tools link thus far, I am going to mention a couple other runner-up components that are filling in some weak spots for this build. Ultimately, all of the components and augments mentioned in this video will depend a lot on the gear that you find for your chest, legs, helmet, and rings, but I'm fairly confident that if you're following along with what we've got, we should at least be close enough that our stats are in the ballpark of each other. You know, like an outfield and a catcher are kind of close in the same ballpark? You get what I'm saying. The other components you'll want, though, are going to be Runebound Topaz on a ring, that is going to give you some defensive ability and reduced stun duration, Mark of Illusions for the defensive ability and energy regen, Runestone for the elemental and aether resistance, Silk Swatch for the pierce resistance, and the Mark of Mogdrogan for the percent health and movement speed increases on your boot. Now, we are going to blast through the augments because the vast majority of them are used solely for increasing resistances that we're drowning from atop the peak of ultimate difficulty. There are a total of 4 augments that you'll need, and these can be applied to multiple gear pieces. You'll get Potent Voidvine and Flameweave Powder from the Homestead shop, as well as Venom Guard Powder and Breath of Life from the Rover shop. Part of the reason we're blasting through these so quick is that you may have some gear in your build that's already filling in these resistance gaps nicely. If that's the case, don't worry about it, go find some other augments to equip instead. Also note that if you are not revered with the Rover or Homestead factions, you won't have access to the Flameweave and Venom Guard powders. The case is usually that if an augment can be applied to all armor, it's only going to be available at the very top tier status of that faction, which is revered. So if you don't like reputation farming, you better get used to it in Ultimate, because it does tie directly to keeping you alive by increasing your resistances through augments. Once again, that is Potent Voidvine and Flameweave powder from the Homestead shop, and Venom Guard powder, as well as Breath of Life from the Rover shop. And that is it for augments. I know, it was super engaging and detailed and long, and everybody needed those explanations. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic, but augments are just, they're very simple. They don't require a whole lot of brain power most times, unless you're looking to increase the offensive potency of your build. But for what we're after right now, defense is the most important, and that is what we are sticking with. Having mentioned the components and augments for our survivability, I do want to direct your attention to some endgame gear that will very much inject an even more insane amount of cold damage and ability into our build. These gear pieces specifically are why I need the augments that I mentioned, because I'm not getting rid of the gear that I am talking about at this stage of the build. What's more is that some of these pieces are actually craftable instead of grindable, so if you can get yourself a recipe, you can shave a lot of time off your ultimate gear progression hours. Another great thing about being able to craft some of the gear is that you can pick the right blacksmith to craft it at to get some very much needed bonus stats depending on what you are lacking. For example, if you need an added boost to Chaos or Aether resistance, you want to go craft at Fort Icon with Helena. Helena gives you an opportunity to get either Health, Aether, or Chaos resist on every item she crafts. All things told, the amounts are pretty small, but in Ultimate, a 4% bump to a resistance that you don't have maxed out is a pretty big deal. It also means you might be able to free up a component or an augment slot in the build too, so you could look at something more offensive or utility-minded rather than pure resistance buffing. All the blacksmiths have their own crafting bonuses, so make sure to pick the right one for where you're at in the build, as long as you're crafting the gear that you're going to pick up anyway. With that detour out of the way though, let's talk legendaries. The first on the list is a mythical, and it is actually usable from level 84, so you can equip it pretty early on once you craft it. The Whisperer of Secrets is a hood that gives you a big chunk of health, offensive ability, and Aether resistance, while also giving you a ring of steel that now has lifesteal and extra bleeding damage on top of the freezing and cold damage it's already doing. Since the cooldown is already super short on this ability and the damage is OP, this equates to a lot of health back for you when you are hitting big AoEs of enemies with your Ring of Steel. The less noticeable bonus of this hood is that it also gives you a pretty good amount of damage reduction from ethereals and their corruptions. Since we've already got the runestone equipped to it, we're pretty much walking into an Aether enemy and telling 15% of their damage to go kick rocks. This helmet also comes with a big chunk of offensive ability and Aether resistance, which are pretty important things for the Ultimate playthrough. Since Aether is finally being reduced in Ultimate, getting a big chunk of it from a helmet is very useful. Whisper of Secrets also gives you Circle of Slaughter points by 3, and you're getting +3 into Presence of Virtue as well. Presence of Virtue being the Oathkeeper passive, that is literally the best thing that we can get on that side of the kit. Now there are a number of other helmets in Grim Dawn in Ultimate that may be more useful, and then Whisperer of Secrets goes. This is, as it stands right now, the best opportunity that we have in the build for a helmet, but if we get a particular helmet that gives us a stronger change to Vire's Might, or potentially more points into something other than Circle of Slaughter, that will be a helmet that we pick up instead. For the time being though, this is basically our best in slot. We're not going to go hunting for anything else, because Whisperer of Secrets does a very good job in what it does, giving those points to those abilities and buffing Ring of Steel even further than it already was. The next item that you're going to want to start building is going to be your belt, and that is for a couple of reasons. The first is that Tinker's Ingenuity provides an astronomical amount of poison and acid resistance along with bleeding resistance. This is also going to increase the caps for those two resistances, so you can basically overmax these beyond 80%, and that will still take effect. You might have guessed from all those Venom Guard augments that Poison Res is pretty hard to come by for this build, and after you're getting that flat health and health regen from this belt, the poison resistance is a massive defensive opportunity for any build that is completely lacking in that department. Lastly, as far as passives go, we're getting another 7% to our dodge chance. You know the stat that totally nullifies melee attacks? This belt already has it built in. Tinker's Ingenuity actually culminates in its ability though, which is going to activate when you drop below 40% health. All your damage is going to go up by 200% along with your health regen, and you're going to get a ton of energy regen on top of those two stats. After all of that, the ever-elusive physical resistance comes out to hang with you at 12%. This build may not check a whole lot of offensive boxes for us, but defensively it is one of the best in the game. And we can leave the conversation right there because I've said everything I need to about this wonderful, shiny, poison-resistant belt. Now, the final piece of permanent, craftable mythical gear is going to be our gloves. The Mythical Ice Scorn Talons are going to be giving you frostburn damage baseline, along with buffs to both cold and frostburn damage with an increased duration. You're going to be getting offensive ability, attack and casting speed, and piercing resistance, to name all of the basic stats. After that, we do have a couple wasted points, unfortunately, in the 2 to Lethal Assault. Since we're not taking Amarasta's Blade Burst anymore, Lethal Assault is not going to be necessary. 3 points into Retribution, however, is something that we can look at on the Oathkeeper side of things because we do travel down that ability tree all the same. Retribution is the final modifier to Righteous Fervor, and while it isn't really doing anything incredible, I think for the cost of 1 point plus 3 that we get from the gear, adding a little bit of internal trauma damage and retaliation damage added to attack to our Righteous Fervor is pretty helpful. Go ahead and put 1 point into that final modifier, and you're going to have 14 out of 12 in your Consecration and 1 point of the base Righteous Fervor. Really, we're only in it for the Consecration part, but we might as well take the buffs where we can get them from our wonderful new gloves. After all of that, however, the gloves do come with their own passive changes to Amarasta's Blade Burst, which obviously isn't any help to us, but Righteous Fervor as well. Righteous Fervor is normally a fire-based attack, but when you put these gloves on, you're also going to add both cold and frostburn damage to it. So when you get into range and start swinging the Righteous Fervor around to get your elemental resistances and attack speed, you're also going to be doing cold and frostburn damage, just like the rest of your kit. Righteous Fervor was that kind of quiet, shy kid who doesn't really think he's super popular, but finally gets invited to the cool kids table, and it turns out everybody really loved him from the start. So let's all give it up for Righteous Fervor, really finally making that guy feel welcome. After your Mythical Ice Scorn Talons are done though, you are going to have to start farming for 2 of the final pieces of gear that will round this build out. The first I recommend getting is the Chilled Red Mantle, and that is because this shoulder piece comes in clutch with the points that you are getting into specific abilities for the build. It has a very good ability of its own, and all of the stats that come along with it, apart from the points that it gives you into your masteries, are incredibly useful for what we need. So, the Mythical Chilled Red Mantle will start out by giving you an additional cold damage or flat cold damage buff. You are going to get buffs to pierce, cold, and frostburn damage. You're getting health increases from the shoulders, as well as big jumps in offensive ability. Your resistances and stun reduction duration are also going to be accompanied with freeze reduction duration, and you have a 20% chance of a very short freeze retaliation when enemies hit you. Now, the points this shoulder piece are giving you will be 3 into Knight's Chill and 2 into Vire's Might. These two abilities are some that have been stuck with us from the very beginning of this build, and that is because they are very important for dealing damage and keeping passive abilities going off as often as possible. Vire's Might obviously activates things through its Flame Carpet and the repetition of dashes that you can do, but Knight's Chill and Veil of Shadow, which is the base ability, will be activating lots more things because they are just actively doing damage around you, passively dealing damage around you, just being near. So, that being said, points to both of these skills are very good for this build because they are very centerpiece to what we're trying to achieve. The ability that you get from the Chilled Red Mantle is called Spines of Ice, and it has a 33% chance when you get hit to shoot out a whole bunch of ice-like razor-sharp spines. It has an almost 2-second skill recharge, which is the cooldown, and it shoots out 6 projectiles. These all pass through enemies in a 0.5 meter radius, dealing piercing, cold, and frostburn damage while freezing targets for 1 second. Not only is this shoulder piece very good for buffing your offensive capability in this build, but it comes with an incredibly good defensive option in freezing enemies for your melee class. Since you're getting close to a lot of other bad guys, they get a lot more opportunity to hit you with their melee attacks, and if you can circumvent dying from those, you also have an opportunity to freeze the bad guys in their tracks and stop them from hitting you even more often than you already were. Spines of Ice is incredibly useful, and I would highly recommend this shoulder piece no matter what you're doing. It is one of the cornerstones of the build, so definitely start farming early and farm as much as possible to pick these bad boys up. And after I just got done talking about how great those gloves were, I have yet another piece of gear that is even more potent for what we're trying to accomplish. The Galewind treads are going to be a level 94 legendary boot, and the number of points that are going to be useful in this build because of this boot is actually even more than the shoulders. We're going to get 3 points into Nightfall, which you will recall is our right click that's coming from Shadow Strike. Nightfall is the big AoE ability that is deciding to drop our Blizzard anytime that we get it to crit. More points into Nightfall means more damage for that ability, which means we're just going to have a better time when we right click people. After that, we're getting 2 points into Clarity of Purpose, which is the modifier to Presence of Virtue, and we're getting 2 more points into Vire's Might, which is our pinnacle ability. Everything about all 3 of those abilities is buffed much better by these boots and the points that we are getting thereof. If you don't remember what Clarity of Purpose is, it is giving you a % increase to offensive ability, and that activates through Ascension. I may have said Presence of Virtue, I meant Ascension. But basically, when you activate Ascension, Clarity of Purpose will give you a 13% bump to your offensive ability. You get Life Leech resistance, Energy Leech resistance by 100%, and you are going to be reduced stun, freeze, petrify, and entrapment duration by 44% at level 10. If you have this already put up to level 10, another 2 points into it will max it out at 12, so you'll get up 50% in those reductions. Basically, that's a detour and another way of saying Galewind treads are incredibly useful for all of the points that they provide, but there's even more stats to talk about, just like we did with the shoulders. Your Galewind treads are giving you an increase to cold and frostburn damage. You're getting more health and a even bigger chunk of offensive ability. You're getting a potentially a big boost to movement speed. You're getting Aether resistance and bleeding resistance, baseline freeze reduction duration. This build should essentially never be frozen with all of the stats that it comes with. But that being said, there is finally the ability that comes along with the boots, which is really great because there are a couple of boots in this game that I really love early on that come with the Howling Wind ability, but they don't really stack up very well in a cold build when you are trying to push ultimate and further into the game. Specifically, Howling Wind has a 15% chance on attack to surround you with a blistering wind that chills your enemies to the bone. This has a 6-second recharge, but a 4-second duration, and it works in about 3.5 meters around your character. This is the kind of spinning, whirling, icy tornado that you'll see around our character ever so often, and it is incredibly good because you're going to be doing all the types of damage that you need with a 33% chance to freeze targets for 1 second. So not only do we have an opportunity to freeze targets when they hit us, but we do have just an opportunity to passively freeze people by walking around them every 4 seconds or so. These boots are absolutely incredible, and coupled with the gloves and the shoulders, they make up a trifecta of really strong cold damage for our Vire's Might Alchemos cold-focused build. I'll also walk you through the rest of the gear that I have equipped to the character right now, just in case you didn't check out the Grim Tools link, but as many times as I talked about it in this video already, I'd be surprised if anyone still hasn't. That being said, we do have the Mythical Nidala's leg wraps for our pants, which come with 2 points to Nidala's justifiable ends. That is the cooldown reduction ability for our Shadow Strike, which is much appreciated, but these pants aren't going to be the most important things to us. They do come with an increase in your chance to avoid melee attacks, which is your dodge percentage, and they offer up a big chunk of Aether and Chaos Res just in time for ultimate. As far as everything else goes, they give you a little bit of movement speed and health, but the damage types that they are going to buff do not in any way help our kit. That said, though, they do come with the offensive and defensive bump of things, so for ultimate, for everything that we're considering, these are probably like a 4 out of 5 star pick for pants. They're very good. We just need something to fit perfectly into the pants slot for this build, and these just don't feel like they're getting all the bells and whistles, but they're still very good, and keeping them on until we find the absolute perfect pants to wear is a good idea. After that, our chest piece is the Frost Dread Cuirass, and this is the armor that we were actually picking up in Elite. It's not it's got a lot of wasted stats. It gives us points to Amaras's Blade Burst, and like I said, that's no longer part of the build. The cold resistance it's giving us is very big, but ultimately we've got a lot of elemental resistance going on anyway. The vitality and bleeding resistance also super good. The reduction to being frozen also super good, but again, these are kind of overlapping stats that don't necessarily make this chest piece shine as much as it could. It's giving you energy regen and defensive ability, as well as flat cold damage to your kit. But most importantly, the reason that I'm using it still is because of the passive ability that comes along with it, and that is the Frost Dread Presence. This is a 15-meter radius dealing cold damage, buffing cold and frostburn damage, and giving you a whole bunch of cold damage retaliation. You also have a chance of 20% chance of a 2 seconds of freeze retaliation too. So it's another very freeze focused defensive chest piece, but Again, it doesn't fill in all of the stats that I want. It's very much like the pants. It's very good for what it is. If I get the mythical version, I'll obviously wear that, but I still feel like I can find something better in both the chest and pant locations that will really fill out this build in the best way. That said, let's talk about rings, because these are the last two items that we really need to focus on. I am using the mythical band of the Eternal Haunt, which I crafted, and the mythical Rain of Ice and Fire, which was also crafted. The mythical band of Eternal Haunt gives us absolutely 0 points into anything that we're using, and it is going to buff only our cold and frostburn damage, while giving us chaos and vitality resistance. It increases maximum vitality resistance too, so getting that overmaxed is very, very good. You need it when it comes to surviving later and later stages of Ultimate, but ultimately, a lot of this ring is going to waste because stats don't line up perfectly with our build. Eternal Haunt, the skill that comes with it, is a 10% chance on attack to deal cold and aether damage while shredding cold and aether resist. It's a workhorse ring at the moment. I know there are better ones out there though, I just haven't stumbled upon them, and this is filling in all of the gaps that are keeping me down so far. The mythical Rain of Ice and Fire is going to be giving you increased crit damage, it's going to be giving you cold and frostburn damage buffs, it's going to give you an actual % increase to offensive ability too, which is incredibly helpful. And you're getting energy regen with total speed on top of everything else. Rain of Ice and Fire is also going to give you elemental resistance, anywhere from 20 to 30%, which is a pretty good chunk, but considering how easy it is to come across elemental resistance in both your component and augment slots, it does feel a little bit extra. This ring, however, does give us points into two abilities that we are using, and that is Shadow Strike and Consecration. Consecration more important than points into base Shadow Strike, but base Shadow Strike buffs are still good because having the base deal more damage means that Nightfall is going to be able to deal more damage on its own as well. There is an ability that comes along with it called Elemental Force 2, and that is a 10% chance on attack to deal fire and cold damage while converting 8% of that damage into health, which is your lifesteal. There's a 33% chance to do burn and frostburn damage with this ring also, but as it turns out, none of that is exactly what we are after. These last couple gear pieces are really just... they're good, but they're not the best. As long as you've got your monster infrequents all farmed up and working the best way possible, and you've got your Chilled Red Mantle, Ice-Scorn Talons, and Galewind Treads, you have got the vast majority of what you need done for this build. Remember also to craft your Whisperer of Secrets and your Tinkerer's Ingenuity, because those pieces of gear are also incredibly good and very, very unlikely to be replaced unless you find something that just is chef's kiss to take the bait. Anyway, that is going to do it for all of the gear that we have to talk about with this build. I may dive a little bit deeper to see if I can just get some really strong rolls, make this build maximum efficiency, and take it into some Shattered Realm runs, Crucible runs, starting Nemesis farming. I like getting these builds up to this point. It is very, very fun to start just shredding things, picking up legendaries and enjoying my time, but it always kind of falls off here for me after a little while. Ultimate efficiency is never really my jam when it comes to action RPGs, so we'll see if this one really tickled my pickle enough to go tickle hunting. Anyway, that is it for me, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging out. If indeed you still are, I will see you all next time. Peace out.